This is the God, Man and Markets podcast, conversations on faith, culture and the economy.
All right, welcome back. I'm here with Dr. Michel Laccade, David Clayton, Father Brad Elliot, and I am Charlie Deist. We're continuing our conversation today on the topic of the common good and drilling down a little bit deeper into some of the theological dimensions. And Father Brad is going to lead off this part of the discussion. Father Brad, you just finished what was it, an STL degree? What does that stand for, first of all?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have an STL degree, sacred theology license. Is what that means. So, licentiate in sacred theology that I just received from the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. So,
okay, and the rest of us, I guess, would be attempting to practice sacred theology without a license, which can be a dangerous thing. So we've got you here to set the record straight when needed. So
it can be just as dangerous with a license. Trust me.
Okay, fair enough. So in that vein, I think that everyone has kind of their own idea of what the common good is. We all consider ourselves sort of self-appointed experts in what's good and what's right, and yet there's a lot of disagreement, especially if you look at something like the political landscape in the United States today. No one can really seem to agree on what we're talking about when we talk about the common good. And beneath the political issues, maybe there's an even deeper reality governing some of this and governing some of the divide. So can you just start off, give us a little bit of your perspective on how we should approach the question of the common good before we just start to pontificate on our own presuppositions and preferences even?
Sure. Absolutely, Charlie. I'd be happy to. In my own particular studies, I became fascinated with the issues of the common good after I was introduced to more of a Thomistic understanding of the common good through 20th century Thomistic commentators. And when I say Thomistic, I mean a notion of the common good that's coming out of the tradition of theology centered around St. Thomas Aquinas, who was philosophically deeply Aristotelian in his thought. 20th century Thomistic commentators wrote volumes and volumes about the nature of the common good, largely because debates around what the common good even is were central to so many 20th century political movements. My particular teacher in this, if I could consider him a teacher, would be the writings of Charles De Koninck, who was a Thomistic commentator around the early 20th century to mid 20th century. He wrote a fantastic commentary on the Thomistic nature of the common good, which is rather short. It's only about 50 pages long. It's called Defense of the Common Good Against the Personalists of the Time, a treatise in which he outlined the nature of the common good as he understood it emerging from St. Thomas's philosophy. The occasion for this body of commentatorial work was this. Almost all of the totalitarian movements in the 20th century trumpeted the common good. They almost all claimed to have the common good as the centerpiece of their philosophy, whether it was National Socialism in Germany, whether it was fascism in Italy, or whether it was totalitarianism and totalitarian communism in the Soviet Union. They all claimed to defend and promote the common good, yet they all slaughter their people. Even sometimes communism, which trumpets the common good, is responsible for over 100 million deaths, as certain historians might estimate. So what gives? What goes? And I think Charles De Koninck was onto something in the 1940s. He saw, in many ways ahead of his time, that beneath so many of these totalitarian understandings of the common good is a false notion of the common good. It's a false notion of the political common good that actually suffocates the individual person, that actually dismisses the good of the individual person, even going so far as liquidating the individual person if the dignified person gets in the way of the state and the state's agenda. Central to St. Thomas's understanding of the common good as a metaphysical principle, first, as a metaphysical principle, is that the common good is not simply any good that happens to be shared. This is the key. The common good is not any good that we happen to use in common. No, a common good is a particular type of good that is good precisely because it is common, not just shared. Let me give you an example. We might all share a pizza. We could all share a pizza. Let's say we're having a party. We're going to get together, the four of us, and someone say, well, let's order a pizza. Let's all chip in some money and let's order a pizza, and then we'll all share this large pizza. Even though we all share a pizza, that pizza is not a common good. The pizza can never be a common good by its very nature. We're going to say, why? If we're all sharing the pizza, isn't the pizza a common good? St. Thomas would say no. The pizza is not a common good precisely because of this point. The piece of pizza that I eat is precisely not the piece of pizza that you eat. The pizza that I ingest is by that very fact not the piece of pizza that you ingest. Although we might divide the pizza up, the pizza is not something that can be shared precisely because it is good. It is only something that can be divided. It is a material thing that can be divided. It's not a type of good that is shareable. Most people in the modern world, and De Koninck saw this very clearly, Charles De Koninck, as he was commenting on the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, that when most people in the 20th century spoke of common goods, they were actually speaking of individual goods that were shared. And that's not what the common good is. The common good is precisely a good of order, which is good precisely because it diffuses its goodness to many parts at the same time. It's a goodness that can never be divided, but it's a type of good that is enjoyed by many without losing its goodness. The pizza is not this type of good. If I enjoy a piece of pizza, that whole pizza is diminished precisely in the very fact that I took a piece. But the common good is different. We can all be a part of the common good equally without diminishing the common good. Now, there's an implication here. This implies that the common good is precisely never a material reality. Material things can never be common goods. This is shocking to a lot of 20th century people. Even common sense for the 20th century would say, well, water is a common good, right? Water is a common good. I'll say, no, water is not a common good. Water is always a particular good. The water that I drink is precisely not the water that you're drinking. It is not a common good. Well, what about oxygen? Oxygen's a common good. Well, no, oxygen is not a common good. The air that I breathe is precisely not the air that you breathe at the same time and in the same place. It's not a type of good that can share its goodness. It's not a type of good that is diffusive of itself. Since the metaphysical common good is never a material reality, it's always a good of order, something like the order of law or the order of society. Culture, for example, is a common good. The order of a culture, the beauty and synchronicity of a culture of people or an ethnicity or a language, which diffuses its goodness to many at the same time, is something that is not a human creation. It is an order that emerges from many parts working together in order. A language is a good reality. We can all use the English language without diminishing the English language. It's a type of order that is enjoyed by many without diminishment. This is the nature of the common good. This is also why, as a common good, human beings do not invent languages out of thin air. Languages are something that emerge. Languages can be protected. Languages can be kind of hedged by certain grammatical rules, but these grammatical rules, for example, don't dictate how we speak English rather than describe how English is already spoken. This is very important. This is the nature of the common good, as St. Thomas understands it, is always a good of order that is diffusive of its goodness. How this relates to the political common good. This relates to the political common good, and this is how I would articulate it, and maybe we can get into more discussions about this in a little bit. The common good, the political common good, is not a human creation. It's not a human artifact that is imposed on people by a state, or by a political unit, or by a government, or by a king. The political common good is a good of order that must be protected. It must have certain conditions established so that it can flourish. But it's precisely not something that can be imposed top down by one single, let's say, totalitarian regime. De Koninck was right in seeing that the majority of the totalitarian regimes in the 20th century had a notion of the common good, the political common good, as a good that was alien to the individual citizen, a good that was somehow other than the individual citizen, that was imposed on the citizen from the top down. From the top down, what I mean by that is just simply almost imposed by a type of coercion. Thus, if the common good was to be loved, the individual was to be loved less. Now, for De Koninck, and certainly for St. Thomas Aquinas, there is no opposition between an individual's love of himself and the individual's love of the common good. The individual loves the common good as an extension of his love for himself because he sees himself as part of the order of the common good, the order of the political whole. And actually, the individual would love himself more precisely because he is a part of the whole of order. The individual would then, because he loves the order of the whole of which he is a part, have something to sacrifice himself for. And it's a sacrifice of self which is actually enlivened by a deeper love of self for the whole. The individual would never sacrifice himself or allow himself to be sacrificed in spite of the common good, or never seek the common good in spite of himself. There is no opposition necessarily between an individual good and the good of the whole, precisely because the good of the whole is an immaterial reality. It's an immaterial reality. What this means, I think, in praxis, is that the true political common good, which consists of the order of culture, the order of law, the order of the economy, and everything that makes up a certain national people, is something that must be protected by the state. It's not something that can be imposed by the state. The state is there to protect the conditions by which the individuals in that order can act for the good of that order. What does this mean? This also means the state is there to establish law. The state is there to establish the conditions by which individuals can flourish. This is also the Second Vatican Council's definition of the common good, which there's a lot of debate going around out there about the Second Vatican Council's definition of the common good. But in Gaudium et Spes, the Second Vatican Council says that the common good is the sum total of conditions by which individuals in society can flourish. The sum total of the conditions by which each individual part of society, each individual human person, can flourish towards the flourishing of the common good, towards the common good. I think that this understanding of the common good as an immaterial reality of order that must be protected is at the root of what I understand to be so many kind of free market principles, where free markets economically can thrive only when there is a very well-established rule of law. When there's a very well-established rule of law, property rights, contract rights, and this rule of law is established and protected by the government, this rule of law becomes a condition by which all the individual players in that society, each acting in their own individual way in responding to those around them, can act towards the common good. not in a way which is antithetical to the common good, but in a way which enriches the common good. So that individual self-interest actually promotes the common good. It doesn't detract from the common good. Individual self-love is not antithetical to love of the common good. Individual self-love can promote the common good, because individual self-love is exercised within the conditions of law and culture that are themselves shared by many at once and enjoyed by many at once. So this might be a little bit of a long soliloquy, but this is basically my understanding of the political common good in the abstract. And now the hard work comes by when we take an understanding of the common good and then apply it to particular cases. So this is certainly where it gets interesting. I think applied to particular cases, I would start here. Oftentimes when Americans think of the common good, or the government must promote the common good, if they were to say something like this, if modern Americans were to say, the government has to promote the common good, generally what animates their imagination at this point is actually some notion of an individual good, an individual material good that is simply going to be divided and distributed, which is not necessarily how a common good works. For example, money. Money as a simple material reality, not talking about the laws about money that actually establish a system of currency, but just simply dividing money up is never precisely dividing a common good. Money as a material reality which is divisible can never in that sense be a common good. It's always an individual good. Now, most Americans, modern Americans, when they hear the phrase the common good, or if they were to utter the phrase, the government must work for the common good, they generally have something animating their imagination, which is like this. The government must take their reservoir of material things and divide it and disperse it to the many. For example, the government must work for the common good means that the government must take their reservoir of money and divide that money up and give a little bit of money to each person in the nation. Thus, if money is so divided, that would render money a common good. Now, for me, coming from a Thomistic understanding of the common good, this is false. Now, why is this false? This is a false notion of the common good because the common good is never a good precisely because it's divided. The common good is not simply a reservoir of material things that can be divided. No, the common good is a unified good of order that is good for each and every one of the parts simultaneously. The government dividing money is not, by that fact, making money a common good. The government dividing up reservoirs of food does not, by that fact, make food a common good. No. What is a common good? The government establishing something like property rights is establishing a common good. Why? Because property rights are something that can be enjoyed by everyone equally at the same time without diminishing those rights. The government protecting culture, protecting the arts, protecting a national language. These are things that are common goods precisely because they are enjoyed by everyone at the same time. The good of culture, the good of language, is precisely a good that is good precisely because it's shared. There's no such thing as an individual language. This is what Wittgenstein understood. Wittgenstein understood this. There's no such thing as an individual language. Language is always communal by its nature. This is because language is a common good. So, I think Charles De Koninck was onto something in his commentaries on St. Thomas Aquinas, because he recognized that so much of what animates the imagination of 20th century individuals was a notion of the common good which was false. And because the common good is such a high and rich good, its corruption is a greater evil. There's an ancient medieval principle that the corruption of the best is the worst. The corruption of the best is the worst. And if the highest political good is indeed the political common good, the corruption of that political common good is going to be an even greater evil. And that's exactly what we saw playing out in the 20th century. In the 20th century, what we saw were totalitarian regimes that sought the common good the way Thomas would say a tyrant seeks the common good. Now, what is a tyrant? For St. Thomas Aquinas, a tyrant is different than a king because a king loves the common good for itself. But a tyrant loves the common good as an individual good of his own self. So a king loves the nature of the common good. A tyrant wants to possess the common good himself, seeks the common good as his own individual good. Marxist communism, for example, sought the nature of the common good as its own individual self-aggrandizement, the aggrandizement of the party, the aggrandizement of those particular people who were in charge, not as a true common good which is dispersive of its goodness precisely as an ordered whole. That's very important. The false common good would always kill the individual for the sake of the commons. The true common good would never kill or liquidate the individual. The true common good recognizes the individual as a constituent part of the common good. The individual could never be liquidated in order for the common good to be increased. No, the true common good and a true love of the common good always loves the individual as part of the common good. This is also why political regimes that have a true common good as their end never snuff out individual rights. Political regimes that truly seek the common good would never suppress individual freedom. True individual freedom, that is, true individual freedom. Political regimes that seek the true common good would never somehow force individuals under their care in some kind of a subservient position to the state, a type of servitude or slavery. No, slavery is precisely not, a slave is precisely not a part of the common good. No, one who is part of the common good is a true citizen. This is what differentiates a citizen from a slave. Certainly in the ancient world, in the world that animated the Middle Ages, in which St. Thomas wrote, a citizen is one who can participate in the common good, is a true part of the common good. A slave is one who is not part of the common good. A slave is one who is precisely underneath a false common good. A false common good that is his other. It's an alien good. It's a separated good that the slave is not an integral part of. The slave is someone who will be liquidated for the sake of the common good. The citizen can never be liquidated for the common good. Never. This is kind of getting back to the heart of kind of an ancient distinction between a citizen and a slave. I think De Koninck was right because he saw that what so many modern 20th century totalitarian regimes do is they actually treat their citizens like slaves, not as true citizens, not as true parts of the common good, not as true parts of the common good. I really don't know where I should go from here.
Well, Father Brad, thank you very much. This is David Clayton here. I have some questions. I enjoyed what you said, and if I've understood what you're describing, you're saying that the common good is something that a good government should preserve, in the sense that it should ensure that the citizens of the state are free to pursue it. It can't actually protect the common good itself because it's an abstract principle. It can neither destroy it nor maintain it. It's just an abstract principle of what is good. So it's effectively an end for people to strive for.
Yes.
So in that sense, what the government can do to protect people's capacity to pursue the common good is preserve personal freedom. And that begins then to sound very like 19th century liberalism, a sort of laissez-faire government approach. Just don't get involved and let people do what they want, as it's often characterized. I don't think that is what happened in the 19th century, but that's the way that it would be criticized, based upon the view of the human person as an isolated individual rather than a being in relation.
Yes.
Can you say perhaps how what you're describing is different from that, or is it very similar to that?
Well, thanks, David. That's actually a very good question. First of all, I will say I would agree with you that the 19th century is mischaracterized as a type of absolute individualist, or classical liberalism as a type of absolute individualism. I think that's sort of a straw man, but irrespective of that, oftentimes the presentation or the notion of the common good that I have presented, and that I think is a more metaphysical, philosophical understanding of the common good, is criticized precisely because, well, what's the role of the state? Is there a role of government at all? And I would say absolutely there is. And there is a role for the government precisely because the common good is a metaphysical reality that emerges when human beings come together in society, as societies. You kept mentioning freedom. Now, it's true that certainly freedom, human freedom is essential for the common good, because the human person is by nature a free agent. The human person has intellect and will, and has the capability of free choice, which must be exercised towards the advancement and the promotion, the realization of the end, which is the common good. The state or the government cannot create freedom. Freedom is something that the human person is capable of. Freedom is human freedom is that remarkably mysterious interchange between the human person's intellect and will in their freely choosing actions towards their fulfillment as human persons. One thing that the state must accomplish is the preservation of those conditions that allow for human beings to act towards the common good. The state cannot create the common good because the common good is not a human artifact. The common good is never a human artifact that we kind of impose. But nonetheless, because the common good is a reality, it must be preserved in the sense of preserving those conditions that allow human beings to flourish in community. And that does mean protecting, in the plural, what we would call common goods, like a stable rule of law, for example. A stable rule of law, that blanket of law underneath which human beings can act in community towards common ends that are shared with other human beings. This does require something like laws regarding stable currency, a stable monetary system, laws regarding contract and property. These are essential conditions for the human person to act in society with other people towards common ends. The straw man characterization of, let's say, classical liberalism or libertarianism, which would simply say that the government has absolutely no role, complete laissez-faire. The government must simply get out of the way and allow a kind of rampant free competition to hasten these emergent properties. There's some truth there. That's why it continues to be a very attractive position to people, but it's not the whole story. It's not the whole story, because the human person does live in society. and can only truly realize their action towards a free end in society with other people, the conditions that allow the human person to live in society must be protected. The conditions must be protected in order for the person to realize their freedom. And the establishment and protection of those conditions necessitates either a single person or a group of individuals who are set apart and given a special deputization to look over the common good, a special authority to care for those conditions of the common good. And the care for that authority necessitates a type of coercive power. It's impossible to separate or completely abstract the idea of authority from the idea of coercive enforcement of law. So not just law which is suggestion, but a law which is coercive, for example, particularly criminal law. Human beings in society could not collectively act towards common ends if criminal law was not enforced, and enforced coercively against the will of those people who damage the common good, like a criminal, for example. Because the common good, because society is a metaphysical reality, it's not just a human invention or a collection of individuals that we call a society. It's not just a human abstraction, but society and community is a real ontological reality. That reality must be protected by those who have authority to care for it and to care for those conditions that preserve it. And so that's how I would answer. I mean, that's abstract. I know that's even a little bit abstract. So we can talk about specific examples, and I'm certainly happy to do that. But that's how, in the abstract, I would answer that critique, to say that my presentation of the common good would just simply be laissez-faire libertarianism. I think there's a lot in libertarianism which is compatible with my presentation of the common good, but it is a straw man to simply conflate the two. Does that help?
Yeah, I'm thinking then that we can look at, for example, a law which says people shouldn't murder each other. I don't think many people would say there shouldn't be such a law, but you can look upon it in two ways, perhaps. Then it can either be seen as a law which is aimed at the murderer to stop them murdering, or a law that aims at protecting the freedom of those who would be murdered. In practice, it works the same way, but the goal is actually the preservation. It's not to stop murderers murdering. If they could do that without having victims, we would say get on with it. It's actually because they're free to make bad choices, but but what we can't have is the freedom of those who would be murdered impinged upon, and so that then defines a way in which government can have be robust and positive in its action, but nevertheless limited, and understand what its scope is.
I think that's a good point. I think that's correct. Yeah. I think that's a good point, because this understanding of the common good as a reality that's an emergent reality, but yet also not a mere human artifact. Not only does it deputize the government towards real action and protection of the common good, but it also naturally puts limits around what any state would be capable of doing in promotion of the common good, because there is a certain point beyond which state interference in order to protect the common good would actually be counterproductive. It would actually impinge upon free human action in society towards the attainment of a common good. Like I said, the state is there to protect the common good. The state doesn't impose the common good. The state can't create the common good as some type of human artifact. The state must protect the conditions necessary for the common good to emerge.
So in other words, people are still acting freely, as we commonly use the word, that they're choosing to do things without compulsion for the most part.
Exactly.
So David, you want the government to protect individual freedoms.
Yeah.
Now, I cannot be free without healthcare, David. I need healthcare benefits. Otherwise, I'm at the mercy of diseases, epidemics, and so forth. So,
Well, yeah. So the question then is, how does what's the best way in which the government can preserve the freedom of people to pursue good health? And one way, what I would say, it's not for the government to get into the business of distributing healthcare, because it doesn't do that very well. And so the best thing to do is to allow people to pursue that. And the things that a price can be paid, it's allowing free markets, and it's to create the conditions in which people care for each other. So the government, there's a freedom in the doctor providing healthcare as well. And so compulsion of that sort is not appropriate. And when it does so, that was going to be my next question, actually. I'm thinking that we might say that, well, actually, why don't I leave it at that? What's your response to that, Michel?
No, I mean, right. I mean, I agree, but I don't, for some reason, I hang up on the idea that the government needs to protect individual freedoms, because in a way, as you said, I mean, freedom is I mean, being a human being is being free, in a way. So there's nothing for the government to add to that.
Well, except to stop people interfering with other people's freedom.
Well, I mean, to stop. I think, but I would say to stop people from criminal activity, and by criminal activity would be activity that is against the common good. But, and I think you mentioned it, Father Brad. But I think one thing I would stress, perhaps a little bit more in the explanation about the common good, is the inherent dependence of human beings on the division of labor.
Ooh, interesting.
So we live in society because we're inherently dependent on the division of labor. Neither one of us can survive alone. So it's complete. It's impossible. It's impossible to live alone. We live in the division of labor. We live in dependency on one another, and therefore we need it's so that implies that there has to be an exchange and sort of a. I mean, you can call them market phenomena. I mean, there has to be a way in which this division of labor, carries itself out, and an attack on the common good is essentially an attack on that ability to have this division of labor proceed.
I completely agree.
Right. So the division of labor implies that you need to have property rights understood as the fact that some people will need custody of certain material goods and do that sort of thing and go from there. And therefore, so the government is not really necessarily here to protect my individual freedom, because my freedom is there even if I'm in jail. I'm free. I mean, in some ways, right? I mean, I may be coerced, but I'm still free. But the government is there to allow the division of labor, which is the reason why we live together in society, to proceed.
I think that's exactly correct. And I think I mentioned this, and I'll just repeat: the government cannot make us free. The government cannot create freedom. Freedom is something that emerges from human nature itself, because the human person is a free agent. Yet the government is essential, precisely because human freedom and the exercise of human freedom is not a disembodied reality. That I exercise my freedom apart from my economic reality, apart from community, apart from where I live, the place where I live, and the things that I need to consume. But it's my human freedom is always exercised and instantiated in a certain place, in a locality, and that requires the establishment of certain social conditions.
Right.
Certain social conditions like property rights, contract enforcement, something like something like those conditions that allow for exchange between people.
So that's actually
And I agree with you, Michelle. The government cannot make me more free, but the government does have a role to protect those hazards in society that can damage my ability to exercise freedom.
Right. I mean, to exercise freedom to participate in this, in the division of labor freely, in a way that is not harmful to the common good.
Mm-hmm.
So those conditions, now you can say, you can say it's law and order. I mean, that would be a minimalist way of looking at it. You want a law and order to prevent activities against the common goods from within, criminal activity, and defense, prevent outsiders from impinging on the common good of your society.
Yes.
Because we live in distinct societies. We don't live in one humanity, kumbaya, global civilization. We live in distinct societies, and therefore, it's possible, and we sense that another society may want to overtake, destroy our common goods, take over our way of living together, and so the government can protect on those two activities. But were you alluding to other conditions, other necessary conditions for the common goods, for the division of labor to proceed? You were talking about language and culture as being worthy of protection. And
yes, I believe that's true.
So can you elaborate on that? So what does that mean for?
Well, language is certainly a necessary social reality. We can't live in society with human beings without communication, without language. This is why human beings develop language. Language is itself a common good, meaning it is a good which is shared. It's a shared good, and it's a good which is good precisely because it's shared and not divided, but precisely creates and causes a type of unity. So it's a type of good that is itself a cause of unity, a cause of social unity. And insofar as language is, first of all, a prerequisite for life in society, but also a good which is a cause of social unity, it also must be protected. Language is something that needs to be protected. We have certainly, not only do we have education, which protects the linguistic laws, but I think language is something that must be preserved in a society. Along with that, culture, we call human culture, and that whole matrix of human artifacts, music, art, the things that make up human culture are also things which are common goods. And insofar as they are common goods, they deserve a recognition and protection. Now,
Charlie,
it can be different.
Right, Charlie, what would Illich have to say about that?
I don't know. He's starting to sound a bit like the advisor to the Queen, who's trying
Nabriha.
Right, Nabriha.
Exactly.
I guess the question would be: does do culture and language need to be upheld with coercive power as well, in your view, or are there different kinds of guardians of that, different authorities?
And this is where I appreciate Illich, actually, because I don't believe something like a language can be either created or enforced by any type of coercive power from the state. I think Illich had a great insight there in his chapter. However, this doesn't remove the notion of a language from the reality that I believe language is a type of common good in society. A state attempting to enforce language from the top down, I think it violates the very fundamental nature of language itself, which is something which emerges. It's an emergent reality from human society.
Another question, playing devil's advocate, Michel was asking about whether healthcare would be essential for people's freedom. And you said that things like environmental protection are not part of the common good by your definition. And I fall back on a couple of definitions from sort of Econ 101, with public goods, common goods. These are two distinct categories where the difference is a common good is something that's rivalrous but non-excludable. So like fishing on a river or fishing in the ocean, it's rivalrous because there's only so many fish, and you can imagine someone going and fishing out all the fish or inventing a new kind of net that just sweeps them all up. But it's not excludable. You can't really stop people from coming to the edge of the shore. And then public goods are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Things like clean air and clean drinking water, where one person's ability to access them don't diminish another person's, but still where someone could spoil the whole bunch. Why wouldn't you include environmental goods in the definition of a public good?
Well, certainly something like clean air might very well be a public good in the sense that it can be used by the public and it's ubiquitous and used by everyone. I would not call it a common good, as I mentioned before. I would not call oxygen or the atmosphere, let's say clean air, for example, a common good, simply because it is not that type of good, which is good because it is shareable. Like I think I mentioned this, but a common good, and this is a metaphysical categories I'm speaking, and not simply economic categories. A common good is not just any good which is shared, but a common good is a type of good which is good precisely as shareable, and it does not diminish in the very reality, in the very fact that it is shared. It doesn't diminish it, but actually only increases it. And so we're fundamentally outside of the realm of material things when we talk about common goods. These are not material realities at all. And because the common good or common goods are certain types of goods, they are capable of eliciting from the human person certain type of love, a type of love that is self-transcendent. And it's only common goods, or the common good, that can establish society, precisely because common goods can elicit from the person something more than just individual self-love, but love for something greater. And it's the love that the common good elicits for the whole of which the person himself is a part. It's that love which is the establishment of human society as more than just a collection of people, but human society as a real ontological reality which is itself loved. And these, I'm speaking in metaphysical categories, not in economic categories, economic categories here. And so in this sense, individually, we can talk about environmental protection laws as something that might help, or that might be a very legitimate role of the state. I won't deny that. I think in the contemporary world, most of these laws are actually quite ineffective. Most contemporary environmental laws are heavily, I think incredibly ineffective for a lot of reasons. Just been heavily politicized, and also, when we speak about environmental laws, I think also there is a conflation in many people's minds between simply public goods, which are individual goods that are shared, and true metaphysical common goods that can be a source of that love which creates society.
Here's another question to sort of try to wrap my head around the definition and why it's important for it to be limited to material or immaterial things. Let's take something like the character of the buildings in a city. I see a lot of pictures. There are whole accounts on Twitter dedicated to comparing the bland city landscapes that we have today with old European cities where it was, all along just much more splendid, and you got a sense that these cities had a genuine character. And in the same vein, when I hear David talk about the fields in England, or the walking paths of England, I get a sense that it is something that he loves beyond just the material component. There's almost an immaterial element to some of these features of the physical world. Could those fall on? And I don't think that current zoning laws effectively bring about the kinds of things that I would love, at least. But are those kinds of laws things that could be used to promote the common good, zoning or certain land use regulations?
Just coming in on the land thing, you're right. I do love the fields of England. But what's interesting is that they were no government policy has been able to create that sort of beautiful land.
Exactly.
That has emerged with farmers acting freely. And the best that the state can do is try and preserve what is there. And they can't direct people to farm in that way. They just couldn't. They're incapable of doing it. I think even if they try, they could have a go.
I would say the same. I would say the same thing. I think that this type of beauty, Charlie, that you're speaking of, is a type of beauty that can never be imposed artificially through positive law. But it's a type of beauty that emerges from that type of love, which the common good elicits from individual persons who love the land upon which they work. They love the land on which they live and the land that they work, and they love the buildings that they are building because they are connected to them. There's a type of property there, a type of ownership that the individuals have of the land and the community of which they are a part, and that love is then able to emerge into a type of beauty, and that could never be imposed by law. That could never be imposed by law. I think law would actually destroy it.
I'm going to suggest a sort of way of characterizing that is that while government can protect personal freedom, I'm going to stick to my guns there, Michelle. The moment it tries to impose upon people how they exercise that freedom, then that's overstepping the bounds of government and as by definition impeding freedom and causes problems. So that might then apply to things like healthcare. That people should be free to pursue health, but the moment the government starts telling people how that care should be provided, it's eliminating by definition that aspect of love which is not freely pursued if it's compelled, and so diminishes the scope for the provision of healthcare, perhaps.
I think that this
I completely agree with that. Yeah.
I think that this gets murky when the world as we know it has so many, let's just say, powerful non-governmental entities. And I'm sounding a little bit cliche here, and again, putting on a little bit of the devil's advocate hat to try to challenge some of my classical liberal priors. But from what I've seen, studying very only with I haven't done a deep dive, but it seems like when you look at the agricultural landscape, it's dominated by a few large agrochemical companies who operate with significant privileges from the government. It sometimes is kind of conflated with free market because it's private companies. But I think that, that this is where it just gets kind of murky as to what would an authority designated with upholding the common good in something like land use, what would be a policy that would eliminate those privileges or level the playing field so that the true emergent order can emerge? Or is there even a one true spontaneous order, or are there many different emergent orders that can all come about based on the different sets of preconditions and laws and governing structures? And if we were to have a Department of Agriculture that did try to actively promote the common good through the through the emergent order of freely acting individuals, what would that look like compared to the current situation?
Well, I think in terms of agriculture, it would be get rid of all the subsidies and all the government sort of policies on agriculture.
Yes.
Really, that's and it's interesting that those fields that you're describing, typically the factory farm fields, are not charming and beautiful. And if you remove that, so you're right. There are huge agricultural farms or agricultural companies, but they can only exist because government backs them up. Effectively, they've got government behind them.
Yeah, but I think that's true to some extent. But I think that there's also the dynamic of, you get regulatory capture, where the big companies can hire lobbyists and lawyers to write the regulations basically in the favor of the industry, and it's hard to say who's wearing the pants, or who's in the driver's seat in that relationship. Is it the government giving the privileges, or is it the powerful corporation? And I wonder if there is sometimes a role for politics to set limits, government conceived of as the authority that does set limits on whether it's an environmental protection. And I agree that they have not done a good job, I think partly because of the degree of regulatory capture. But if you look at things like, agricultural runoff, this would be sort of a textbook case of a public bad or a public good being violated by something that in some sense is a free action of a private corporation. They're exercising their rights on their property, but it has these sort of spillover effects. And in the first instance, I think that they're material, but I think that there could also be a metaphysical component to that. But I use that term somewhat cautiously, because I don't know that I understand all the implications of physical versus metaphysical.
Now, I would say that the classic liberal response to environmental pollution and whatnot would be that you don't need anything beyond the protection of property rights in general. So if the big factory is polluting the river, and one can demonstrate that there's actually pollution, then you can use, property. I mean, if you choose to enforce, there's some historical, it's debatable, but there's some historical evidence that was actually the way things were getting done up until the middle 20th century or early 20th century, until, for the sake of efficiency, some quote unquote pro-free market economists said, forget this. Why don't we just put a price tag on what the damage is, and allow these externalities to proceed, but then we'll just compensate, and we can make some utilitarian calculus, that sort of thing. But otherwise, if a society is very serious about property rights, then the small guy with who's getting polluted by the big factory should have his day in court, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's always difficult. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
But it's, that would be the principle. A more difficult situation is, since we're talking about culture and beauty, what if the neighbor builds a really, really ugly structure in his backyard, right in front of you, and all that stuff? Is there a role for government to step in and say, this is against the emergent order of the beauty of our society?
Well,
I think that's tricky. Tell me, David, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, I've thought about the sort of the giant shark sort of diving out of the ceiling. There's a house in Devon in England, I think, where this guy built a fiberglass shark which emerges from the roof of the house as though it's coming out of the water, and it's about 15 feet long or something, and all the neighbors tried to stop it. And so I think that you can. I've thought about this, so I don't know I've got an answer to that. It's a good objection. First of all, I think that generally in the long run, the ugly will disappear. that doesn't help you in the short run when the guy blocks off the light or something, or you have to look at this thing. But I think there may be a case for saying that local communities can institute a local government that regulates those sort of things if people can freely enter into them and come out of them. So if you go to is it Long Island, I think, the Hamptons or whatever, I think you can't even put a pumpkin out on the lawn without infringing some sort of local regulation. But people want to go there and they'll abide by it because generally they like the overall effect it has on the community. But if they don't like it, they're free to go elsewhere. I think that's what I might do. So I'd allow for sort of what we might call government type action that we tend to associate with federal government, or even state is probably too high in this country, to work at a city level or a neighborhood level, maybe a sort of local community scale, perhaps.
I think that's right.
These goods that we're talking about, for example, the beauty of a landscape, the beauty of kind of a type of uniformity in the architecture of a particular community, all of this demands a rich notion of subsidiarity in society, so that you have local communities, small local communities composed of people who have an ownership over that community, also have strong authority over what goes on in that community, free from the interference from either like state or federal government, free from interference, so that local communities who made, like I said, of people who have that love of the community, can freely act towards the beautification of their own communities. And I think subsidiarity plays an important role in that. Oftentimes, as Americans, when we ask ourselves, what's the role of government in X, Y, Z, we immediately think of federal government, which is this behemoth from sea to shining sea, and that I think it really obscures our ability to effectively talk about what things are common goods that the government can properly influence. Does that make sense? Yeah.
No, it does make sense, and I think we have to remember that common law, can emerge from sort of private, essentially what essentially are private courts or private judges, without the need for the state courts, that the kinds of state courts we're used to. And I think if you look at the history, I'm not super familiar with the history of legal history, but I think there can be a trend where, there are arrangements, there's common law that emerges from sort of understanding within communities. So, as you said, the closer we get to the local level, the less coercive it becomes, because at that point it's based more on understanding within people. Or if it's coercive, then at least it gives a little more possibilities for people to just move maybe to the neighboring town and so forth and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if any of you know Dana Joyer, who's the is he the poet laureate of California? And a Catholic, and very committed to beauty and poetry and trying to promote poetry, and was appointed by George Bush to be head of, would it be the National Council for the Arts or so? I don't know what it is.
Endowment, the NEA.
Yeah, the National Endowment.
The NEA. I spoke to him once about this, and he felt that the answer lay in the NEA's pursuing a more active role, and was trying to work against the defunding of the NEA by the Obama administration. Actually, I think. But actually, on that one, I'm on Obama's side. I would get rid of the NEA. I think that effectively becomes state-imposed art, and it can't really succeed in the long run, I would say.
I agree with you, David. Yeah.
Right. Now let me throw a curveball. Maybe it's going to be a weak curveball, but let's say I agree with this vision of the common good as being something abstract that ties people together. But I have this view, and I understand how history proceeds through time, and history is proceeding through stages. And we're gonna reach a stage where we can have a classless society, and there will be a common good, the common good of all the people, and we will be all united, and it will be terrific, and human beings will flourish, individual human beings will flourish in this classless society. In the meantime, of course, there's a lot of people who oppose this idea, and they're criminal because they oppose really the true common good that is to come in the future age. And because they're opposing this, this view of the common good that I can see through my historical analysis of epochs, succeeding one another, they need to be disposed of because, the common good is greater than the individual good.
Well spoken,
Well,
Karl Marx.
Right.
Yes, yes. Exactly. Well, certainly, I think it's just absolutely beautiful idea, but I think that is completely, I think, a very false utopian dream of somehow the ultimate common good of the cosmos, which is the good of order of the entire cosmos, would be so completely conflated with the political common good that there's no longer any reality to local political community at all. No reality to the polis of Aristotle, which even according to Aristotle could really be no more than 100,000 people. I mean, Aristotle would say if you give them over 100,000 people, it's no longer even really a city. It's a complete conflation of these, and this is a misunderstanding of the relationship between the individual and the common good, so that the individual is almost completely eclipsed by the reality of the common good. The individual is subsumed into the common good to the degree that the individual's personal dignity and the personal dignity given to each individual is almost something that is itself instrumentalized for some kind of a collective whole. And that's very dangerous. I think it's a very dangerous idea. The individual in society is related to the common good, to the whole society, the way a part is related to a whole. And so the individual loves the common good the way that a part loves the whole, which is more than itself. But the part doesn't love the whole in spite of itself. The part loves the whole as the whole, something within which and for which the part even receives a greater dignity than it had. Part. And for that, the human person must be situated within communities that the human person can, first of all, can truly know, and then love, because love must follow upon human knowledge. And love always follows upon knowledge. And we simply, as human persons, cannot have a proper love emerging from some kind of an abstract knowledge of the whole global Marxist utopian community. That's simply nonsense. That's simply nonsense. The human person, as a part related to the whole of society, is not like an organ related to the body. That's important. For example, like my hand is a part of the body. If my hand turned gangrene, I would simply cut off the hand to preserve the entire body. Now, there's a certain truth there, but there's a certain truth that the human person is related to society as a part to a whole. But the human person, unlike the hand, is also, in a sense, a whole to itself, a whole that can understand. It's a whole that can understand that greater whole of which it is a part, and a whole that can then love itself and its place within the whole. It's precisely because of that love that human communities become ontological realities in themselves. This is why the polis, the city, becomes something that has it becomes something that's not a mere human invention, but it's a real ontological reality where human beings come together and live in societies. This is why boundaries between cities, boundaries are not just human projections. It's not just a projection. No, but the boundaries are real ontological realities because they separate true human communities that are ontological goods in themselves. And there really is no, I don't really believe that it's possible for the human person to be a political citizen of the globe. I don't believe it's possible to be a citizen of the world. Because I don't believe it's possible for the human person to have that type of elicited love, to be a citizen of the world. No, we are citizens of local communities. We're citizens of families, citizens of local communities, citizens of cities, states, in an ever increasing layers of real autonomous groups.
Right. But let me tell you that Marx was not. I don't think he viewed the individual subjugated to the whole eventually. Look, this is what I'm going to quote. In communist society, this is from the German ideology. It's a famous quote, so you may have heard it. In communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. See? We can communist. We will all become like Charlie in communist society.
It's the liberation. I mean, Marx. It's almost as if when Marx was promoting this vision of almost like what he thought was like the true, like the state disintegrates away, the state goes away, and then you have true society emergence. But it's almost as if he's describing the liberation of the individual from society.
Yes.
It's almost like what he's talking about is the Promethean individual, which is then liberated from the reality of the division of labor. You know, and this is why what Marx would claim to be a common good, the common good of the whole cosmos, is actually a complete draining of the notion of the common good. It's the liberation of the individual from the common good, so that the ultimate highest good in Marxian ideology is that liberated Promethean individual which stands by himself.
Right.
And this is why I think guys like Charles De Koninck were really on they put their thumb on the pulse of what was going on within Marxism and socialism, because Marxism was constantly talking about the common good, constantly going on and trumpeting the common good, but it was a materialistic notion of the common good, which was actually instrumentalized towards the liberation of the individual, which is a misunderstanding. And Charles De Koninck was I think very insightful, because he realized that if we're truly going to defeat Marxism, certainly Marxist economics will always fail. And he saw that Marxian economics will fail, but he said that if we're really going to put our thumb on the pulse of what's wrong with Marxism, we have to realize that they're fundamentally operating under a perverted notion of the common good, a common good which is simply instrumentalized towards my own individual flourishing.
How about this as a response? Say, okay, I accept all your arguments about the state and the common good, but I like public goods, and I'll accept your distinction between the common good and material public goods. Why not just extend, in my vision, the role of government to equitable distribution of public goods? In other words, set up healthcare, set up water utilities, distribute food. Isn't that a good thing? Even if it isn't a common good, why not just say let the state distribute public goods?
I would say that would actually be a contraction of the true common good, precisely because of what you mentioned before, David, is that becomes a complete elimination of human freedom at the expense of human security and human safety.
Yeah.
the human security, human safety. Then you actually eliminate human action altogether. You eliminate true human free action altogether, where individuals are in society organized around common action, true common actions, but individually freely acting towards the good of society. Rather, they are like what Aristotle would say, just the slave which has his meals provided for him, the slave which has all of the material necessities provided for him, precisely because he is instrumentalized. The slave is not a true citizen of the family. The slave is simply worker. So let's just have the state as the one who has the coercive power over all of the material needs that we have. The state will just provide for everyone equally. There's no distinction between the citizen in that type of society and the slave on a plantation.
Mm. And so, in other words, by overstepping its natural role, it inevitably strays into the area of imposition of solutions. In other words, it's telling people how to exercise their freedom, and that is how a tyrant operates.
Exactly. That's a type of, it would be a type of tyranny, because then the common good is no longer a true good. It's not an end. It's not an end which has it's a good which has the nature of an end. The common good is merely everybody's on a material level having their stomachs full and having a roof over their head. So a common good is simply this material collective, and that's not a true good. That's not a good that human beings can love as a good that is greater than themselves. They simply can't. That's not the type of society that can elicit the type of self-sacrificial love that the poets speak of. It's not the type of good that can elicit the type of love that can be the source of a true human society. It can be the source of a collection of biological human beings, but not a human society.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, the temptation to believe that if government could, because it's got so much money and it can tax effectively, could do this is alluring to so many. And I was thinking about the sort of healthcare. I grew up in Britain where people just love the national health system. It's a sort of it's cherished by the British people. We used to look at the American system and have a picture of people dying on the streets because they couldn't get, because hospitals were turning them away, and we thought, well, thank goodness we don't have that. And I remember when I came to the US, I still don't really, and I know that the US system needs changes, but it's very different from the British system. Let's put it like that. But one of the things that I would say to Americans is that I think a lot of British people are happy with just having all of this provided for them. They wouldn't argue against it. But the one thing that is certainly true about it immediately becomes a mechanism for control and restriction of freedom in other ways. So you have to conform in your diet because the NHS picks up the bill if you have a heart attack, and suddenly you get this spreading totalitarianism or the spreading regulatory environment. Let's call it.
That's right.
Call it that.
Right.
And then of course this is what's happened in the last year. It's right. And we can see that it doesn't even help in health terms because it's a one-size-fits-all imposition. It's not taking into account individual needs because the health, I'm going to suggest, is something that each of us should strive for personally, freely.
Yeah,
I agree. I don't believe health is a common good.
It's an individual good for sure.
Yeah.
Well, as we can wrap up here, but I was wondering, it might be helpful to examine recent articles written by prominent Catholics that deal with this question of the common good, and maybe examine them in light of what our discussion today and what Father Brad, taught us. So maybe we can do that next time.
Yes. Okay. Do we go to Jacques Maritain, by the way, the arch enemy?
Well,
I think we might at least address it. It's maybe a little complicated to I think to pin down what Martin's thought, at least
Yeah,
to me. So
I've
maybe if Father Brad is ready to do
I'm
that.
yeah, I'm no fan of him because I didn't like what he wrote about art and culture, so
Yeah.
make me want to read anything else he wrote.
I mean, I've read a lot of Jacques Maritain, although it has been a while. It's been a number of years. I would have to brush up. Jacques Maritain has a lot of great insights, of course, but I think he's off about a few things about the common good. So,
Right. I was thinking we just confront or read what people are currently talking
okay.
about.
Yeah. All right.
And then examine that.
That sounds better. Yeah. Okay.
great.
Terrific. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, guys.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.